user story mapping is really a really useful way for both businesses to understand if they have requirements, they want to set up something, a new product, a new service, what's a good way that they can explain it, explain their requirements to technology partners, and so that, when they give requirements, it makes sense. And they're not going to like scramble on, think of ideas and then tell them, oh, I want this, I want that. And then later on, oh, I forgot about this. And you end up not having a complete product that you can really go to market with, right? And then as a specialist as well, knowing this kind of approach will actually help you to have a structure to guide through business owners to give you the requirements. If you're doing a product owner role, this is really helpful because you kind of see the big picture and not just see bits and pieces of requirements. And that's where user story mapping is useful. I would recommend a book. You must have heard of, there's an author, his name is Jeff Patton, and he wrote a book on user story mapping. He's a guru on user story mapping. You can Google him. It's a good resource to know. But what I'm going to do tonight is give you the basics, of user story mapping. There's pretty much 8 steps, 8 simple steps to do in user story mapping. I'm going to go through them in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And then, as I introduce the concepts, the best way to learn really is to have an experience of how to do it, right? So later on tonight, we will be having some interactive sessions where you will be working in groups. And you will be given a case study and actually apply story mapping in that case study. We'll probably divide it into 3 or 4 groups, given the size, right? So what I want to do now is distribute the handout. So we prepared a one-pager handout. Probably Jason can help me distribute that. So you can follow through the, the 8 simple steps. Yep, the 8 simple steps in doing user story mapping. All right, so user story mapping really is a tool to help visualize, an end-to-end flow of the user experience of a service or a product, right? And why is this particularly useful? Because imagine if you were a business or a startup and you said, okay, you tell your technology partners, okay, I want to create this product, and you give them the requirements. And some of the requirements you say, okay, I want them the ability to log in to a website. I want them to be able to search for my products, right? So your developers started to code, create a page that allows you to log in, creates a capability to search, filter things. But then you forgot, I forgot to tell them, okay, make that payment functionality so you can pay by credit card or, even as simple as that. So suddenly you've got a product that allows you to log in and search, but doesn't have the functionality to pay. So you really can't go live without that, right? So just having an end-to-end full picture of a capability, that really makes business sense, right, is important. And story mapping allows you to have that big picture that kind of that allows you to see the end-to-end process. So, and that's why here are the 8 steps. I'll go through the 8 steps quickly. So the first 5 steps, and they're very, very simple, really, is around creating a story map is identifying the backbone. Like really identifying, when you say the backbone, the storyline. And what you do really at the first one is individually, you describe the different tasks from a user perspective of how you think they will use your product or your service. So I'll give an example. So let's say, if imagine user, you want to use Amazon.com, right? So you'll have to think of, as a user of Amazon.com, what will I do? I need to log onto the website with my user ID, password. I need to be able to browse all the products in their website. I should be able to see, compare some products, see some recommendations, select the products that I like, check the prices. Then I should be able to select the ones I want to buy, and it will add to my shopping cart. If I have discount codes or voucher codes, I should be able to enter those, and I should be able to pay, right? And I should be able to specify the address by which I get paid and my payment method, if it's credit card or PayPal, and yep, and then ship to me. And then when I get the product, maybe I probably give a recommendation, something as simple as that. So the process of identifying each of those steps, that's pretty much number one. So later on in the group exercise that you'll be doing, as part of doing step one, what you'll do is you'll specify individual tasks in each post-it note. So, creating a login screen would be one post-it note, and then creating, browsing in the capability to browse will be in another post-it note. So you'll write them down, and you'll do them individually. And then, as you go to step number two, what you're going to do now is in your groups, you're going to then combine and any of the common tasks, because some of you may have thought the same thing, right? So you're going to combine common tasks, and then for those that are, essentially you're doing a deduplication process of removing duplicates as well, and streamlining it, so that there's unique tasks for every step in that process. And this is the beauty of it, of working in groups, because you may have missed something that someone else would have thought of. It's like, of course, I forgot about that. So you kind of get the benefit of having collective thinking. So that's step two. And then on step three, what you do is you order the tasks from left to right in a fashion that, it's almost like a story. The start, the middle, and the ending. Similar to how I describe how you use the Amazon website. The moment you enter the site, things you do when you're inside the site until you finish your transaction. And then you order pretty much your different tasks in that order. So I'm just going to do a demo here. And I have a tip as well for those of you who don't use Post-its much. There's a technique to make sure Post-it notes stick to the wall well. So what you do is you peel it off from left to right, like this, rather than like pulling it out from the bottom. It will stick longer in the wall. So you identify, you create your tasks, and then you arrange them, in a sequence that tells the story of the user journey. And that's pretty much step three. And so what you do next in step four is then you identify you will notice that some of the tasks actually fall under a larger umbrella of activities, right? They can be grouped, and you can actually categorize them in a broader category. So let's take an example. Let's say authentication. So, or authentication is the broader activity, but inside authentication, you can talk about logging in using your password. You can reset your password, and you need to restore your passwords. So all of those little steps that you can write on, there is an overarching activity which you can call authentication, right? So let's say, so what you do is once you pretty much have your storyline, you look at all the steps and see, okay, some of these are groupings of a bigger activity. So let's say, you've got steps here that talk about, I need to enter my billing address, I need to enter my credit card information, right? I need to confirm the price, or enter my discount code. So if you notice, all of those activities kind of relate to a broader activity called payments, right? As an example. So you'll have to look at what are these broader activities, and you create another Post-it note on top of it that pretty much shows the activity. What this does is, you may have like a number of Post-it notes, right, throughout that define all the key steps, user steps. But as you define the activity above it, essentially, that becomes your backbone, right? And that's And by doing that, you really get to see now the big picture. To be able to have a fully functioning, business capability that supports, your business, you need to see what happens at a high level. And you can also say what happens from a steps perspective. You can actually use this approach for both doing, a minimum viable product, which is a small product, or you can actually use this approach as well for really, full-blown commercial activity. And some of the agile product owners, I've talked to, they've shared with me, like in some of their clients, they've actually done this activity in the floor. It's like too massive, it's in the floor. And at the same time, remember, sometimes when you're talking to businesses, they'll share with you what they comes up, in their mind, like, oh, I think I want this, right? And you really don't want to discard that idea yet. So you want to be able to capture that. And later on, you may need to, and which we will go later in the next steps, to prioritize which goes on first. Which ones will be your MVP, and then eventually, how do you build that product, bigger, moving on. But this approach is useful, from an MVP or even really large projects, because it really helps organizes things. This is really the power of user story mapping. It helps, it organizes all the user stories in a visual way that makes sense, right? All right, so far we've covered, step 4, and then the next one is really step 5 is really just looking if there are any gaps, right? So later on, again, in your groups, have a think. Are there some missing steps? Are there some things that we still need to remove? So you really want to test for gaps so that, as a collective, you get to see, you have a complete end-to-end business process. And that's those 5 steps written there. That's really the creating the backbone, right? Because the next step really there is now you're going to map out user stories into this picture. So for those of you who who've been working in Agile, who wants to share what's a user story? So a user story is pretty much a one sentence that describes a piece of functionality, capability, that is required, pretty much. And it has a very structured, a sentence structure to it. So it usually starts with as a, then you specify the user role, right? As a, so you can write that down if you want. So as a blank, whatever user role you want it to perform. I want to or I need to, and then you specify the goal or the objective that you want to achieve. And then the third part is so that, and then you specify, what should you be able to do as a result of, that capability. So, I'll give an example. So an example of a user story would be, as a frequent flyer owner, I want to be able to see my points balance so that I can check if I can use it to buy my ticket. That's a user story. Make sense? I mean, very simple structure. So, or going back to the Amazon example earlier, as a Amazon user, I want to be able to search my favorite. I want to be able to search the catalog, so that I can I can buy my favorite product. So you want to be specific in your user story. So user story, there are some characteristics of user stories you want to keep in mind. So there's a very useful acronym, and you can write this down. It's called INVEST. Invest in your user stories. So INVEST. So I stands for being independent. So you really want each user story to be standalone. You can implement them by itself. There's no dependency. So that's I. And then N is negotiable. So you should be able to open to conversation with the business owner on the scope of that user story. And then V should be valuable. It needs to provide value to the business, right? And then E, should be estimatable. So it should be have enough details to allow the people who will build it to estimate the effort, right? So you should be able to kind of give an idea of, get enough details for them to see how much effort it will take to do it. And then S, it should be small. Small enough that it should be able to, to be finished, to be completed, ideally in one iteration. If you can do it as small as that, and a small iteration means, like, for those who have been doing Agile, right, typically 2 to 3 weeks in a sprint cycle is what we call it. Yeah. So if you can do something and finish in 2 to 3 weeks, that's small enough, right? And then T, it should be testable. So there should be a way to measure that it actually meets a requirement, right? There's an acceptance criteria that can be met. So that's a good check to see, if you're creating a user story, check if it kind of meets that criteria. All right, so what you need to do now, as part of step 6, right, is you want to create user stories for each of the steps that you have created. Because, you can have a number of permutations, a number of scenarios for every feature that you've actually defined at this level. So what you'll probably end up with is you will create a number of user stories here, and this is where you kind of have to do it collectively as a group. You will say, as a user, I need to be able to do this so that. As a user, I need to be able to do this so that. And this is where you pretty much generate as much user stories that you can think of that covers specific user tasks. Does that make sense so far? Yeah, and you try to map, where's this user story, which task should it fall under? And that's the process of mapping it, essentially. So in the end, you'll have something like this. You'll have each of the tasks above it. You'll have at least, a number of user stories in it. So later on, each of your group will create one of these. So just imagine I've filled in everything. All right. Any questions so far? User stories. As many as you can think of, essentially. There's no limit, really. As much as what the business user wants to in this, any scenarios you could think of that fits in. Because you can think of, what if this user does this? What if this user does that, right? You need to be able to cater what a user could do. You can actually, there's a concept called personas. I don't know if you guys, some of you have heard of it. So persona is kind of like, different type of user types. So sometimes you may want to be able to cater for different personas, user types of your application. So I'll give an example, which this will be the exercise you'll be doing later on. So think of Uber, for example, right? So if you're using the Uber app in your mobile phone, you can use it in 2 ways. You can actually be the person who needs a car, right? So you need to go from point A to point B. So you can do this from that perspective. Or you can be the driver, the Uber driver, who also needs to use the Uber app as well, in a different way, right? But still, you still need to map how they use the Uber app as well. Does that make sense? Or if you have a website, you can either be the user, or you can also be an administrator, maybe. So you need to think through, what types of user actually needs this to be able to use this service. Right? So you can do that. What we'll do later is we're actually going to divide. I'm already giving away the activity. So later on, we're going to divide the 2 groups, and we're going to work on the Uber case study, actually. So, yeah. So, so far, we've done step 6, which is map the stories, right? To expand user time. Yeah, it's pretty much the depth, the granularity of a specific feature. So you can go as deep as you want. So the beauty of this, of a user story map, is you can have as much breadth, as much as your storyline goes, and you can have as much depth. And you have the whole picture. So after you've essentially expanded or exhausted as much depth and breadth in your user story, then it's a matter now of prioritization, which is the most important thing to do. So that you don't miss it, in the future, you might, and things may change, right? But at least you've captured some of the thinking of, requirements that people have initially thought of. They might not be applicable later on, but there was a way to capture it. Which moves on to really step 7, and this is really the important thing, right? Build out the map with prioritized stories. So you really want to prioritize according to the business value that each user story will do. So at this point, what you're going to prioritize are these user stories that create the depth. You're not going to touch the user tasks. This has already been taken care of in step 5. Your job here in step 5 was to make sure the sequence is correct and there's nothing missing, or you've removed the duplicates. And then what you've done is exhausted all the scenarios you can think of, right? But what you need to do is prioritize that according to what actually brings most business value. And there's a technique that's really useful to do that prioritization, and it's called MUSCO. So you can write that down. So MUSCO stands for, M stands for must have, and then S stands for should have, then C stands for could have, and W stands for won't have. So must have is, these are user stories that absolutely need to be in the system when it goes live, non-negotiable. It needs to be there, that's why it's a must have. Should have is, it's something that the system should have, but I can actually live without it, if it comes to that. Like, if I can go live without it, but the system should have it. The could have is, if I have enough time, enough budget, more time, I would have wanted, it could have had this feature as well. And then won't have are user stories where, you actually don't want them in the system. You want them to be out of scope, so you want to spell that out. So what you do now is, in that next exercise, you need to go through all of this, user stories, and then start to categorize. Which one? Is it a must-have? Is it a could have, a should have, a could have, and a won't have? And you put them in the right order. So let's say, and put all the must-have at the top, then the should have, the could have, and the won't have. So what you'll end up with really is an ordered, prioritized order of user stories here. And that's really the essence of step number 7. So can I just borrow so at this point, right, everything below the line are all the user stories. So at the very top, you've got the activities, the key activities, which is your backbone. And then you've got the tasks, which is your storyline. And then here you've got your user stories. So what you do with your user stories is, everything that's must have, should have, could have, and won't have, you arrange them in that sequence. And you can even draw a line, right? And probably say, okay, this feature is probably a, could have, this probably, I don't want that. So you kind of rearrange it. And then, so what happens is, when you have this picture, it becomes clear now that obviously what's important to you to build right away are the ones in the must-have, right? And then that will become the basis when you're doing a release planning. This will be the first set of user stories that will now need to be delivered on your first sprint. Right. You can even prioritize some of them as well. The important thing there, why this is important, is you need to be able to create a set of user stories that does a full end-to-end capability to make sure it brings business value as a whole. So imagine if you just delivered a set of user stories that only delivers this set, and you were not able to include this set. then what use of it, what's the value that it brings to the business if they can do this capability from an end to end, right? So always think of like an end to end big picture, and then all the other features you can add on later on. Well, there are pros and cons of this approach, right? I mean, the obvious pros, obviously, is it gives you a holistic view of the business, like a big picture. It gives you a really good visual. You know, it also helps identify the gaps. So yeah, some of the cons, though, of this approach is the dependency tracking. So dependency tracking, for example, is very difficult, especially for very large, like user story sets. And change requests, change tracking is not inherent in this process. You will have to have really good, like a lot of documentation on top of this process to track changes. Correct. So yeah, I mean, again, it's not a, there's pros and cons to this approach. Yes.
Is it perfectly sequential?
Yeah, it's like what do you mean by perfectly sequential?
If you're going left to right,
Mm.
is that all sequence, the sequential?
Yeah, in this, yes, so in the sequence of your user journey experience. So does that make sense? Or
I mean, because if you loop round and round, to the circumstances of what the project really is. If it's a website, it's going to be left to right, but there's going to be
okay,
software experiences where it could be a loop
yeah,
situation.
yeah. Well, you can look at it look at it from you can look at it from a, like if I was from a business, if I was offering a service and a product, how would I like my end user customers to transact in my business? At some point, there's a beginning and an end, right? There is a way that they go through my system, and there's a way that eventually they'll purchase something and exit. So that's kind of the storyline that you want to map out in that, sequence. Obviously, inside it, I mean, like example, when we're browsing in Amazon, right? There's many ways you can do that. You can like check recommendations, browse, filter, like, but in the end, you still go through a sequence path. I mean, same as if you use Uber, there's a way you start using Uber until you finish the transaction. Yes.
Like mapping the happy path, or doing should it be a new mapping for unhappy path, like catering different scenarios?
Yeah, so the scenario, so the sequence itself is the tasks level, right? But when you create the user stories, that's where you create scenarios. So your unhappy path and happy path, these are the different user stories you define here. And then you determine, is this happy path important for me to go live? Is it a must-have? Or maybe I have an unhappy path, but what's the likelihood of this happening? Is this important for me to go live, or I can take the risk and go live knowing that this is unlikely to happen, but it could be an unhappy path. Is it worth doing it, or it could be a should have? Again, it's really a matter of determining what's the priority of that user story, that happy path or unhappy path. Either way, that's where you define the scenarios. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, so step 8 pretty much, the last step there is knowing that once you have this picture, you now know that your release planning, you have this slice of which ones you develop first. Or as a business owner, this is what you tell your technology partner, I want this first. Because this is important for me to have a full end-to-end functioning business capability. Is that clear so far? So that pretty much wraps up the steps, right? So hopefully that introduces the concept. So the best way to learn the concept is by doing. So we're going to be doing this in groups. And so we'll go through the objective is to have you go through the 8 steps pretty much in groups, and you can use the tables, so it's easy to lay it down in tables pretty much. So you'll be given post-it notes each, and we'll probably divide it into 3 groups. So this group, and this group, 3 tables. And the case study that we will use is Uber. So you're going to create the user story map for Uber. And what I'm going to do is, given that there are different personas, obviously in the Uber setup, two groups can use the setup where you use Uber as a customer, like a customer who needs a ride, and then one group can use the Uber as an Uber driver who uses the Uber app from that perspective. So for that group, you need to create the story map from a Uber driver user perspective of the app, right? So again, go through the steps so that you can visualize, what are the steps, then what are the tasks, what are the activities, what are the user stories, and then you kind of do this. So at the end of the exercise, if you were launching Uber, your own version of Uber, what will be the must-haves, right, that you need to develop first? Just to give you a sense of how to do this. And obviously, this is just a practical, a practice exercise to give you a sense of this. All right, and we'll probably do that in half an hour. And it's a good way to interact with each other as well. So yeah, so we'll have people in this group with this table, another one this table, another one this table. Any questions with the instructions?
But there are just 2 user stories we have to work?
Sorry. So there will be like 2 personas. So let's do this. This group will work on the Uber customer who needs a ride, same as this group. And the middle group, you will be the Uber driver. And then let's listen to what we end up with. All right.